The cold wind bit into Michelle's skin as she stepped out of the car, her eyes fixed on a house she had once called home. It looked the same, too much the same. The white paint on the wooden panels was slightly more faded, the flower beds now overgrown with weeds, but the place still held an eerie stillness, like time had been trapped within its walls. She hesitated. The weight of the past pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. 8 years had passed since she last stood here. 8 years since she had left without looking back. Yet now she was back. Aunt Sarah had called her. "Your parents need you, Michelle. Come home." She hadn't asked why. She hadn't wanted to. But something in Aunt Sarah's voice had unsettled her. An urgency, a quiet desperation she hadn't expected. Now, standing at the edge of the driveway, she wasn't sure if she had made a mistake. The front door swung open before she could knock. "Michelle." Her mother's voice was soft, careful, as if saying her name too loudly might shatter something fragile between them. Michelle forced a small nod. "Hi, Mom." For a moment, they just stared at each other. Her mother looked older, thinner. Her once perfectly styled hair was streaked with gray, her eyes tired. Then her father appeared behind her, his expression unreadable. "You finally decided to show up," he muttered. Michelle felt a sting in her chest, but swallowed it down. "Not today. Don't start today." She stepped inside, and the air smelled exactly as she remembered. Faint traces of cinnamon from the kitchen, the aged scent of old wooden furniture, and something else. Something heavier. A presence. She shook off the strange sensation and followed her parents into the living room. It was exactly as she had left it. The same floral couch, the same dark-wood coffee table, the same framed pictures on the walls. Except one was missing. Her own. The spot where her graduation photo had once been was empty. She clenched her jaw. So they had erased her. She sat down stiffly. Her mother fidgeted with her hands. Her father sat with his arms crossed. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. "Where's Aunt Sarah?" Michelle asked, breaking the tension. Her mother hesitated. "She's not here right now." Something in the way she said it made Michelle's skin prickle. "She's the one who called me," Michelle said carefully. "She said you needed me." Her parents exchanged a glance. Her father's expression darkened. "There's a lot to talk about," her mother murmured. "Things have changed since you left." Michelle's stomach twisted. Then, from the hallway, a soft creak. She turned, and her breath caught in her throat. Jessica stood there, her sister, the one who had been the reason Michelle left in the first place. But the girl standing in the hallway was not the Jessica Michelle remembered. Jessica was pale, too pale. Her once bright eyes were hollow, rimmed with deep shadows. Her hair hung in limp strands around her face. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Or weeks. "Jessica?" Michelle's voice barely came out. Jessica didn't speak. She just stared at her, unmoving, unblinking. The air in the room felt heavier. Then Jessica turned and walked away. No words. No reaction. Just gone. A chill crawled up Michelle's spine. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The silence stretched long after Jessica disappeared down the hallway. Michelle could still feel the weight of her sister's hollow gaze, the eerie emptiness in her eyes that sent a chill through her bones. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She turned back to her parents, searching their faces for some kind of explanation. Her mother wouldn't meet her eyes. Her father sat stiffly, jaw clenched, as if daring her to ask. "I don't understand," Michelle said finally, her voice tight. "What's wrong with Jessica?" Her mother inhaled sharply, but it was her father who spoke. "She's just been through a lot." Michelle narrowed her eyes. "What does that mean?" Another look passed between them. The kind of silent conversation that had always made her feel like an outsider in her own family. "She's been sick," her mother said finally. "It's been hard on her." Sick. The word sat uneasily in Michelle's mind. That wasn't just sickness. That was something else. Something deeper. Before she could press further, a soft noise drifted from the hallway. A whisper. Faint. Almost like someone calling her name. Michelle's stomach tightened. "Is she okay?" she asked. Her mother hesitated. Her father stood abruptly. She'll be fine. Just leave it, Michelle. Leave it. Just like that. Like nothing was wrong. Like Jessica's lifeless stare, her skeletal frame, the way she had disappeared without a word. None of it mattered. Michelle had spent years learning to ignore the things his family tried to bury. But this she couldn't ignore. I want to see her, she said firmly. Her father's face hardened. She needs rest. Something inside Michelle snapped. I haven't seen my sister in 8 years, she said, her voice rising. And you're telling me she doesn't even want to talk to me? Her mother flinched. Her father's hands balled into fists. Her mother started, but a loud crash from upstairs cut her off. Michelle's heart lurched. For a moment, no one moved. Then she bolted. Ignoring her parents' protests, she sprinted up the staircase 2 steps at a time, following the sound. She reached the end of the hallway, where Jessica's bedroom door stood slightly ajar. The air was colder here, much colder. She pushed the door open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn so tightly that barely any light slipped through. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled, the floor littered with old clothes and papers. The air smelled stale, like something had been left to rot. And then she saw her. Jessica sat on the edge of the bed, facing away. Her shoulders were hunched, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Jessica? Michelle whispered. Jessica didn't move. Michelle stepped forward slowly. And then Jessica laughed. Low. Hollow. Wrong. The sound sent ice through Michelle's veins. Jess? She tried again, reaching out. Jessica's head snapped around. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. Jessica's eyes, they weren't right. They were too dark, too empty, as if something inside her had been hollowed out. And then she smiled. A slow, eerie smile that made Michelle's blood turn to ice. You shouldn't have come back, Jessica whispered. Then the lights flickered, and the door slammed shut behind her. Michelle stood in the dimly lit hallway, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob to Jessica's room. The house felt colder than before, as if something unseen had seeped into its very walls. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant ticking of a clock. Her parents had barely spoken to her at dinner. Their conversation had been forced, their smiles brittle. Something was wrong, and she could feel it pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Jessica sat on her bed, back turned, staring at the window. The moonlight cast a pale glow over her figure, making her appear almost ghostly. Jessica? Michelle's voice was quiet, careful. Jessica didn't respond. Michelle took a hesitant step inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath her weight. I know things between us have been difficult, but I'm here now. Can we talk? Jessica slowly turned her head. The moment Michelle saw her face, her breath caught in her throat. Her sister's eyes, once warm and full of life, were hollow, distant. There was something unsettling about them, like she was looking through Michelle rather than at her. A slow, chilling smile crept onto Jessica's lips. You shouldn't have come back, she whispered. Michelle felt her pulse hammering in her ears. What do you mean? Jessica let out a soft, almost lifeless laugh. You don't belong here. A shiver crawled down Michelle's spine. Jessica, stop, she said, trying to mask the unease creeping into her voice. I'm your sister. Jessica tilted her head. Are you? Michelle's fingers tightened into fists at her sides. What's wrong with you? Why is everyone acting so strange? Jessica's smile didn't falter. They're not acting, Michelle. They're just tired pretending. A cold dread settled in Michelle's stomach. What do you mean? Jessica didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the drawer of her bedside table and pulled something out. Michelle barely had time to react before Jessica tossed it onto the bed between them. It was a photograph. Michelle hesitated before picking it up. Her hands shook as she turned it over. It was a picture of her family, without her. Her parents stood side by side, smiling. Jessica was there too, her arms wrapped around a faceless figure whose body had been roughly scratched out of the image. The edges of the paper were burned, as if someone had tried to erase a part of history. A chill raced through Michelle's veins. Jessica, she whispered, her throat tightening. "What is this?" Jessica's voice was soft, almost melodic. "It's what they wanted." Michelle looked up, her breath quickening. "Who?" Jessica's eerie smile widened. A sharp knock echoed through the hallway, making Michelle jump. She spun toward the door. Silence. Her pulse thundered in her ears. And then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob twisted with a slow, deliberate motion, and Michelle felt every muscle in her body tense. The air in the room thickened, the temperature seeming to drop as an unnatural silence filled the space. Jessica didn't move. She just sat there, watching. Michelle's heart pounded as the door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. Nothing. No one stood there, yet the pressure in the air remained heavy and suffocating. She turned back to Jessica, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" Jessica's expression didn't change. "You still don't understand, do you?" Michelle clenched her fists. "Understand what? That you all want me gone? That this family never really wanted me back?" Jessica let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "It's not about what we want." The word sent a cold shiver down Michelle's spine. Before she could speak, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, like something far larger than a person was approaching. She turned toward the door again. The hallway was still empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. Then, suddenly, they stopped right outside the door. A sharp, ice-cold fear stabbed through Michelle's chest. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a step forward. If this was some twisted game her family was playing, she wasn't going to let them win. She reached for the door, and then she felt it. A presence. Something there, right on the other side. Watching. Waiting. Her breath hitched. And then, slam, the door violently shut itself, the force rattling the entire room. Michelle stumbled back, crashing into Jessica's desk. Her sister still hadn't moved. She just sat there, that eerie, knowing smile never leaving her lips. "You need to leave, Michelle." Michelle's hand shook. Now." Her sister's voice had changed. It wasn't teasing anymore. It was pleading, terrified. Michelle had spent so long resenting her family, questioning their motives, trying to make sense of why they had treated her the way they did. But now she realized it wasn't about them at all. Something else had been lurking beneath the surface all along. Something older. Something waiting. She turned on her heel and ran. Out of the room, down the hall. The house around her seemed to groan, the walls tightening, the air thick with something unseen but suffocating. She nearly tripped as she reached the staircase. "Mom! Dad!" Her voice echoed through the house. No answer. She rushed down, feet pounding against the wooden steps. When she reached the bottom, she froze. Her parents stood in the middle of the living room, completely still. Their faces were wrong, expressionless, their eyes glazed over like they weren't even there. And then, in perfect unison, they turned their heads toward her. The motion was too slow, too unnatural. Michelle's stomach lurched. She took a step back. Her father's lips moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his. "You were never supposed to come back." Michelle's body locked up. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Her mother took a step forward. Her limbs jerked unnaturally, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "We buried you," she whispered, voice hollow, mechanical. "Why did you return?" Michelle's blood turned to ice. "No," she breathed. "This isn't real." Something behind her creaked. She turned. Jessica stood at the top of the stairs now, her face twisted with something between terror and guilt. "I tried to warn you," she whispered. "You don't belong here anymore." Michelle's breath came fast and ragged. She was shaking. None of this made sense. And yet, somewhere deep in her bones, she felt it. The truth. This house. This family. This reality. It had moved on without her. And she was nothing more than a shadow, an echo of something that was never meant to return. Her head throbbed. Her vision blurred. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, the house itself rejecting her presence. She didn't belong here. She never had. She sucked in a sharp breath and ran. She didn't stop, not when she reached the front door, not when she threw it open, not when she sprinted out into the night, the cold air burning her lungs. The house loomed behind her, watching, but it didn't follow, because it didn't need to. She had never really escaped. She had never really left. And somewhere, deep within the walls of that house, a memory of her still remained.